So good evening. It's so nice to see so many of you here this evening. I'm Reshat Kasaba. I'm the director of Jackson School of International Studies. I'm just here to welcome you and to introduce my colleague who will introduce our speaker. Jackson School, in the last 5 or 6 years, we have decided to pay more attention to the United States. There was this assumption that international studies is everything but the United States. That, of course, is really not tenable. So I am very pleased that we are doing a lot on this topic. I just want to mention to you that in the spring quarter, we will have a 10-week series on Trump in the world. This is the third of a similar lecture series that we hosted. It'll be a series of Jackson School faculty speaking about different parts of the world and talking about how the changes in the U.S. foreign policy under President Trump is perceived and how these changes influence different parts of the world, but also some lectures on themes like climate change, social media, and migration. So this will be in spring, every Tuesday, 4:30 to 6 p.m. In this building, Kane Hall, room 220. It is open to public, and there will be announcements of the lectures, so that's something you might want to keep in mind. So in studying the United States, we have started this program within the Jackson School, which we call U.S. in the World. And as part of this effort, we hired several years ago a young, stellar academic. We're very proud to have him with us, Daniel Besner. He is teaching courses on U.S. foreign policy, history of U.S. foreign policy. His book, Democracy in Exile, will come out in a month or so, and he has, in the short time that he's been with us in the Jackson School, he has already made a reputation for himself as an excellent teacher and a really distinguished scholar and a very cherished, valued colleague. So Daniel will introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, and I'm looking forward to the lecture and to the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, to the students and to the members of the community of the University of Washington and the broader Seattle community. We really appreciate it, and we can't do it all without you, so thank you. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Odd Arne Westad, who's currently the S.T. Lee Professor of U.S.-Asia Relations at Harvard University, where he teaches at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Professor Westad is an expert on contemporary international history and on the Eastern Asian region. Professor Westad won the Bancroft Prize for the Global Cold War, Third World Interventions in the Making of Our Times, which many of you in this room, I know for a fact, have read or at least have been assigned to read it. The book has been translated into 15 languages, and it won a number of awards in addition to the Bancroft. And I have to say, as a historian, it's a dream to write a book like The Global Cold War, which is not only brilliant in its erudition and its accomplishments, but also is widely recognized as such. Many people write brilliant books, but they're not always recognized as such. But this one was, and it's a real pleasure and an opportunity for Professor Westad to be here. And Professor Westad's new book is titled The Cold War, A World History, and it was recently published in 2017 by Basic Books in the US and by Penguin in the UK, and I strongly recommend anyone who's interested in the Cold War take a look at it. It's really another brilliant, brilliant book. It's essentially a new history of the global conflict between capitalism and communism since the late 19th century, and it provides the larger context for how today's international affairs came into being. But before I introduce Professor Westad officially, I just want to make one note about questions. If you have a question at the end of the talk, please line up on either side. And I'm going to repeat something that I heard once at a conference. your first sentence of a question should be a question, and there should be no second sentence. So please keep that in mind when you decide to ask questions. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Arne Westhead.
Published last summer in the UK and a little bit later at the beginning of the fall here in the States. The last thing I'm ever going to write, I promise, about the Cold War in any broader sense, at least. And it really comes out of a very long time of reflection on that particular topic in its sort of broader implications. So Dan said that some of you at least held in your hands one of my earlier books, The Global Cold War. And for those of you who actually opened it, you would have found that that's a book that tries to make an argument about the significance that the Cold War had on a global scale for countries in what we used to call the Third World, which would see political project. So that's a book that really says some of the most significant effects of the Cold War and some of the most long-lasting ones, those that are still with us, did not happen in Europe and did not happen in the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, but they happened in the global South. And that was an important thing to say, and that's what I said in this book. So in the one that I've written now, what I tried to do is to sum up many of the things that I worked on since then and present what is a more comprehensive international history of the Cold War. So in case you were wondering, why on earth has this guy done two books on roughly the same subject, except for getting more in terms of royalties, this is the reason why. So they are different in that respect. So I want to give an outline, just to begin with, of how I put this book together. So the reason why it was published now is that we now have access to a lot more material on a global scale about the Cold War than what we had only a few years ago. Part of the reason for that is, of course, that more time has elapsed since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the interstate Cold War. But another reason, I think, is that a lot of people who are working within this field and on whose shoulders I quite literally stand with regard to reaching for the interpretation that I try to come up with in this book, has put a lot of pressure on governments in various countries, not least in this country, to release the kind of materials that are necessary for historians and other social scientists to come up with a more comprehensive new interpretation. So what I do in this book just wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't been for the many who are pushing in the direction of more openness about these kinds of issues, not just in the bigger countries or the great powers, but across the world. So that also made it possible for someone like me to start thinking about doing a new history of this whole era and put it together in ways that I would argue are somewhat different, not just in terms of focus, but also in terms of overall interpretation from what we have seen before. This is a book that tries to put the Cold War as an ideological conflict within a 100-year perspective. It's a book that starts in the 1890s with the first global capitalist crisis, the first one that had a real global span, the first time people started asking serious questions about the Cold War, about capitalism as part of a Cold War being an international system that could be questioned, that could be, one could ask serious questions about. It also starts out from the radicalization of significant parts of the labor movement in trade unions and in political parties, in part as a reaction to that crisis, starting in Europe, but also spreading elsewhere. So for the first time, you have people coming out of working class organizations who are saying maybe the world should be construed differently, maybe it should be organized in a different form than what has existed before. And then thirdly, the 1890s is the time in which the countries that were going to be the superpowers within the Cold War international system, Russia and the United States, expand as transcontinental empires. So all of this come together right at the beginning of the 20th century and formulates what is a much more long-term conflict over what the future is going to look like, based on very different principles of human organization, how we are going to set up our societies. And that's the framework in which I want to present the Cold War. That it goes through the whole 20th century up to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is where the book pauses in order to look forward to the situation that we are having today. So let me stress at the beginning that I'm, of course, perfectly aware that within that 100-year period, a lot of stuff is happening, right? A lot of other things that are different from the Cold War. 2 world wars, a global depression, decolonization, European integration, the rise of China, the effects of climate change, a number of things that are happening throughout this century that are not dependent on the Cold War in its ideological form. So this is not an attempt at subsuming everything else that happens in the span of a century under one neat framework. It's the opposite. It is trying to understand what the Cold War was about and the effects that it had because it was influenced by other things that were happening elsewhere. But it's also an argument for how the Cold War influenced most other things that were happening, and very often for the worse, right? In terms of how these conflicts actually work themselves out. So it is an attempt at situating the Cold War within a century-long development. It's not an attempt at saying the Cold War is more important than the other stuff that's happening. It's an argument for saying we have to understand the ideological Cold War, the conflict between socialism and capitalism, within this broader framework. Because if we don't, we won't understand it at all. We won't be able to grasp it, or it's reduced simply to a framework of 2 great countries, 2 massive states confronting each other. And that's a reduction almost to the absurd of what the Cold War really was about. So, like all historians, I'm dependent on some degree of periodization in order to make sense of this longer time period that I'm looking at. Historians love periodization. I mean, we can't really make do without it. And in this sense, I think it's also important to give you an impression of how I constructed the book for you to get a sense of the significance that I put to different parts of the story in terms of how it developed. So the first time period that I look at in the book goes roughly from the early 1890s and up to 1917, up to the year of the Russian Revolution and the year the United States entered the First World War. So, you know, it's a time period up to when you have these 2 states, these 2 gigantic states, right, that are engaging themselves in a much broader and much fuller sense outside of their own borders. And that's important because if this had just been a story about 2 political projects that were different, and couldn't really work well together, well, that might have been important, but it wouldn't have come to take over the world, for the best part of 100 years. It is when these countries go out in the world and really try to fashion the rest of the world according to their images of the future, that this starts to have a broader impact on how most people in the world would lead their lives. So the second period goes from 1917 and up to 1941. So it includes the Great Depression, which is crucial, I think, in order to try to make sense of what this conflict was all about and why it became so intense. So I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later on. And of course it includes the coming of another world war, signaling again why the stakes are so high for many of the people who grew up during this period. And then, thirdly, the period from 1941 to the early 1970s. So why the early 1970s, you may ask? That's mainly, and again I'm going to talk more about this later on, because of the economic transformations that started to take place during the early 1970s with the collapse of the economic and financial system, often referred to as the Bretton Woods system, that had been put in place after World War II. And my argument is that the effects of that reconfiguration of the global economy are with us all the way up to today. So those are still significant today, even if the Cold War as an international system has disappeared, right? And then the fourth and last period is really trying to deal with the 1970s going up to the end of the Cold War. Why did the Cold War end the way it did? Because most people who were looking at this, writing about this, from that latter stage of the Cold War, in various different ways, they did not all think alike, but many of them were thinking about this as an incredibly solid, durable, long-lasting political and economic system. I don't think any of them would say that this division of the world was going to be with us forever, but they would get pretty close to saying that, right? The idea that the Cold War would suddenly go away as the organizing principle of international affairs, if you ask that question as late as the mid-1980s, at least if you did so in a professional sense, not only wouldn't you get tenure, but you'd probably be sent off to have your head examined, right? So the assumption was that this was going to last for a very long time, and then all of a sudden it ended. Right? There are important lessons for us today when we think about international affairs to take out from that. So as Dan said in his introduction, I teach history and international affairs mainly in a public policy school at the Kennedy School of Government. Right? So I'm preoccupied with history for history's sake, but I'm even more preoccupied with history in terms of how it can help us to ask better questions of the present, of the time that we live in ourselves. And of course, the knowledge of history, the understanding of history, is most of what we have to go on in making sense of our own time and in thinking about the future. So in that sense, this is really, really important. So in the book, I also try to approach the Cold War, particularly the Cold War as an international system, compared to other international systems. So I tried, at least to begin with, to think about this comparatively. And this is actually quite interesting for those of you who are trying to make sense of this in a sort of broader context, which I guess would be most of us. The bipolarity of the Cold War, that you have two main countries around which the international system is configured, is actually quite uncommon in history. It doesn't happen often. Most international systems are either multipolar, so they have many different countries that are contending for power and influence, a situation that is more similar to where I think we are heading at the moment, or they're unipolar, so they have one big country, usually an empire at the center, that dominates everything else and everyone else. Those are the most common configurations that you have in terms of international affairs. There are some other examples of bipolarity, but they're not many. There are, for instance, the rivalry between Rome, by imperial Rome, and Persia in the first parts of the first millennium. They are the confrontation in China in the 11th and 12th century between the Song and Liao states. That's probably the one actually that comes closest to being like the Cold War, because these were two states, two Chinese states, that had ideas that had much of the same origin, but interpreted these ideas very differently in terms of how society was supposed to be organized, tried to avoid a direct conflict between the states themselves, but rather fought a lot of wars through proxies. There are lots of similarities in terms of that situation in China back then in the 11th and 12th century. And of course you have England and Spain in the mid-16th to the early 17th century. Spain being the established Catholic power at the heart of Europe, very much believing that they could organize the future alongside their own ideas. And you had England, which was this upstart country entirely on the European outskirts, as it looked in the 16th century, that had very different ideas and a very different form of Christian religion, Protestantism, that went along with it. That also was a bipolar system of a sort within Europe. But there are not many of these kinds of cases. And that makes the Cold War even more interesting, I think, when you try to understand it and you try to figure out why it became so intense and why it became so predominant. And I think this issue about how predominant the Cold War became as an international system is a very important aspect, at least for me, in trying to make sense of this. So the Cold War came to affect almost everyone, even people who wanted nothing to do with it. So if you lived in Latin America or in India or in Southeast Asia or in relatively peaceful Norway where I grew up, to some extent or another, if you were born within the middle part, roughly speaking, of the 20th century, there was no avoiding the Cold War. Because on a whole range of issues, people were pushed to take a position. Maybe first and foremost an ideological position, right? So which one of these big plans for the improvement of humanity do you actually want to go with, right? Not in this big philosophical sense, but in terms of which organizations you joined and who you worked with and what kind of aims that you were seen having for yourself. But also this broader sense that there was a direct threat implied if you did not act in the way that your superiors or those who tried to give direction to your lives assumed that you ought to go in, right? So that disciplining aspect of the Cold War was also very important. And of course, over and above all of this was the threat of global warfare with the use of nuclear weapons, which really sets the Cold War apart. This totality of it, the absolute conviction about one's own ideas as being the only ones that could conquer the future. Because if the other side won out, it would be better that the world went down in a cataclysmic war. That's also quite rare in human history, quite unique. And this is one of the reasons why I am so interested in trying to understand the Cold War within this broader context of the 20th century. Because I don't think you can understand it. You can't understand why people thought the stakes were so high without understanding the world that they came out of. What they had experienced as young people, roughly at the same age as most of you who are here today. So if you were born in the 1890s, when my story starts, for instance, born in 1893, like my grandfather, the world that you grew up in was not going to be a very pleasant place, right? Almost wherever you were born in the world, if you were born in the 1890s, you had a lot of trouble ahead of you. The two world wars, the global depression, the dissolution of many societies, the conflicts over colonialism and decolonization, all of this seemed to concentrate within a generation or maybe a generation and a half. And this sense that things had become very, very bad I think is the main reason for understanding, the main resource that we have for understanding why people were willing to take such incredible risks with the future of humanity as they were during the nuclear arms race. Because that can only be explained, I think, by the stakes being incredibly high, so high that you felt that if your version of the future did not win out, then all hope for humanity was lost, right? Now, most of us today wouldn't quite think that way. But if you'd gone through the First World War, for instance, particularly if you had served in that war, as many of the people who came to institute the Cold War as an international system had, then you would think differently about the stakes, about how important what you were doing for the future actually was. So I think it's important to bear that in mind when we reflect on the Cold War today. So in the early 20th century, of course, there were a lot of different conflicts around. And as I said to begin with, I don't really think that all of these were direct results of the ideological conflict between socialism and capitalism. But many of them were influenced, most of them were influenced in one way or another by differences over what you could call market-oriented economies on the one hand and social collectivism on the other. Fascism, National Socialism in Germany, Japanese militarism, all had this in common, that they constituted some form of critique of the way in which markets seemed to have failed at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's important to understand this broader context as well. This is not just about the narrow sense about people, joining socialist parties or adhering to ideas about business and market-oriented development. It's about people asking very fundamental questions about how the world was going to be organized along a divide in which people really had to find their own position. So that brings me to this overall issue of trying to figure out how this ideological divide became an international system of states that lasted for almost 2 generations. Because there is nothing given about that. So I'm not the kind of historian who would say, sort of A leads to B, and that's necessarily the way it is. At all points in history, just like today, people make their own choices, right? They do it, as Karl Marx was fond of reminding us, not under circumstances of their own choosing, and that's one of the truest things that he has ever said, but they still do it. People decide on their own future based on their own ideas and concepts. Now, no one in the early part of the 20th century would really have been able to predict the kind of war that the Second World War became, right? No one would have been able to predict, I think, that Germany and Japan would, as it were, had a second attempt at becoming hegemons within their regions. And certainly no one would have expected that within the same year, Japan and Germany would end up in a war against the United States, a war that they themselves had declared. Now, if you look at the whole trajectory of 20th century history, in terms of the increasing significance in almost all things of the United States, that's a pretty stupid thing to do, right? Getting yourself into a direct conflict with the world's growing superpower. And of course, the Germans did this twice over because they also, in the same year, got themselves involved in a war against the Soviet Union. So in terms of the outcome of the Second World War, that's dependent on war. It's dependent on warfare. And it's important to be aware of that. So the fact that in 1945 there were only 2 countries left standing as great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, came out of the way in which the Second World War had been fought. But, this is, I guess, what Marx wanted to remind us of, this is not a necessary outcome, but it's a very likely outcome. It was likely in the sense that these 2 countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood for comprehensive sets of values that people adhered to not just within their own countries, but also elsewhere. They were global alternatives, as it were, in a way that Nazi Germany or fascist Italy or militarist Japan never could be, because they were too preoccupied with their own development. They were too inward-looking, right? So that's the one thing. The other aspect, which is the materialist aspect to this, right, is that only the United States and the Soviet Union had access to the kind of resources because of the enormous territory that they controlled that were necessary to fight a modern war of the intensity of the Second World War. All the other powers also had access to material resources, but most of them was overseas or they were newly conquered, and they were therefore very difficult to mobilize, right? So that's not accidental. That's something that is significant and something that comes out of the past. I mean, the fact that Japan, during the Second World War, were able to construct 5 aircraft carriers, while the United States at the beginning of 1945 was capable of producing an aircraft carrier every second week, that's not accidental. That's something that comes out of the massive productive capacity that this country had and which could be transformed into warfare purposes. Now, one of the reasons why I was interested in writing this book now has a lot to do with re-establishing the autonomy in historical terms of the Soviet Union. Because we sometimes tend to forget that today. I mean, there are even people writing in this country who says the Cold War is all about the rise of the United States. Right? From the beginning of the time period that I'm covering and all the way up to the 1990s, the Cold War is really about the relentless rise of the United States. And I agree that that's one part of the story, but it's not the full story. And it's really important when you do stuff like this that you recognize the big picture, but you don't try to take agency or autonomy away from what's happening elsewhere. So what the Soviets did was not a reflection of what was happening in the United States. I mean, people in the Soviet Union, or elsewhere for that matter, during the Cold War, as today, acted for their own reasons. They didn't act because they somehow were connected to what the United States was doing or not doing. And re-establishing that is really important because it helps us understand, I think, a bit of what is going on today. So the fact that the Soviet Union wasn't just a dissatisfied power at the edges of Europe, but rather did become the other superpower, not just through its nuclear potential, but through many things that the Soviets were trying to do, is important. But it's also very important to me to stress that the Soviet Union acted according to a different logic from what the United States or Western Europe or Japan did, a non-capitalist logic, which we may be very critical of, I think, with some, in my view, very good reasons, most importantly because it didn't end up well, right, in the end. But it was even so for real. I mean, these people believed in abolishing markets entirely. They believed that the best way of organizing the economy was through central state planning, and only through central state planning. They didn't do away with markets because they were forced to do away with markets. They didn't isolate themselves from the capitalist world economy because they were forced to isolate themselves. They did this because they marched to a different drummer. They believed in different kinds of issues than what most people in the United States and Western Europe would believe in at that time. And it's important to recognize that difference and that logic, right? Not all things are equal. Not all issues in world politics are about interests narrowly construed. I mean, that's as true, I think, during the Cold War as it is today. So that was one important reason why I was writing this book. Another reason was that I wanted to build on some of the stuff that Dan mentioned before that I did in some of my earlier work by trying to look at the Cold War as a global conflict and not just a superpower or Europe-centered conflict. So I try to deal in this book seriously with areas, countries, continents that are not often included into the broader understanding of the Cold War. So one of these is Latin America, which I think is one of the most interesting areas for research on the Cold War era that we have today, maybe the most interesting of all. And it also helped me to try to figure out how the Cold War was different in different parts of the world. Let me use Latin America as an example on that. So what you could say about that continent, or about that region, stretching all the way up to Mexico, is that there had been, in social and to some extent political and intellectual terms, a set of domestic Cold Wars that had gone on within different Latin American countries, between the left and the right, that were there before 1940s, before the Cold War became an international system, but which then fed into this global Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, right? So this idea that Latin America was simply at the receiving end of the Cold War, something that was introduced from the outside, I think is entirely wrong. I think people within Latin America were agents, were able to handle and develop these kinds of ideas on their own, and took international positions, first and foremost in working with the United States, on the side of many right-wing Latin American nationalists, that came out of their own understanding of power relationships in their own countries. And this is important to me because it helps us to understand how the Cold War could become an international system. It was because so many people in different parts of the world, who in my view ought to have known better, were willing to buy into this ideological divide. They thought there was something in it for them, right? That they could benefit in one way or another by making these kinds of links. That didn't only happen on the right, it happened on the left as well in other parts of the world. But there was a significant buy-in, I guess we would call it today, that it is important to understand. That's not the same thing as saying that the United States did not act through interventions. Think Guatemala in 1954, or the attempts at influencing Brazil in the early 60s and Chile in the coup against the elected Allende government in the early 70s. But it's saying that the United States could not just act at will. It was not just its own agent that intervened in Latin America. In most of these kinds of cases, there was a push and a pull factor that came out of domestic circumstances in the various Latin American countries. And I think so much of the most fascinating research that's undertaken on this now come out of people who have the skills and the background to understand both sides of the Latin American Cold War, both what comes from within and what comes from without. Well, traditionally, we've seen those as two very different stories. Another region that I spent quite a bit of time on, in part because the work hadn't been done before, was India. So India is generally seen as being on the side of the Cold War, right? Seeking a non-aligned foreign policy, trying to talk about third world solidarity, all those kinds of things. And I think most of that's definitely true. But just like every other part of the world, it was very difficult for independent India to completely set the Cold War as an ideological conflict aside. In part because the people who became the leaders of independent India in the Indian National Congress strongly believed that some of the instruments that had helped develop the Soviet Union, meaning central planning, was very much something that they could benefit from in terms of the development of independent India as well. So I started my research on this, believing that the Cold War in India, or what you could call development ideas in India, ideas about central planning in India, more came out of the colonial experience than out of the Cold War. That it was more, Lasky than Lenin, that it was more the LSE, London School of Economics, where I used to work before, than it was what happened in Moscow, right? That's not true. When you actually start looking at the papers of the Indian Central Planning Commission or other people who introduced planning into India, you will find the Soviet Union as a very direct inspiration and model. In the same way as you did in China, roughly at the same time, in a number of other countries. It wasn't difficult, I think, at that point, and this is a really important lesson for all of us, to think that the Soviet Union, at least in these terms, was the future, right? That centralized planning was perfectly rational, much more rational than a chaotic market system, capitalist system, that had led to a succession of crises. So if you're Indian in the 1950s, it's very understandable why you're asking the question, what kind of progress has capitalism delivered? Certainly for India, right? And that you would be looking for something else, for something new. And that's the connection, I think, at that point to planning coming through the Soviet experiment. So let me conclude talking a little bit about how the Cold War ended and why it ended the way it did. Why this very unlikely scenario of going from a totally predominant international system over onto the demise of that system could happen within less than a decade. So I've said before, and I say in this book as well, that it's very important to think about many ending points for the Cold War. It didn't all end in the same way everywhere. It didn't all end at the same point in time everywhere. The Cold War, just like it had different kinds of origins, had very different endpoints, dependent on where you are in the world and what kind of issues that you are looking at. Some of these have to do with deeper structures, and some of them have to do with policy making, with people making up their mind about moving in a different direction. Some of them are leadership driven. So I spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union back in the Reagan era. So everyone here will know that the Soviet leaders in the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev and his people, started coming up with ideas about international cooperation that would take us away from the Cold War. And that's a very important reason why the Cold War ended the way it did. But there were also reasons on the US side, which were at the time, and I lived in the States at the time, quite surprising and sometimes shocking, that you had what was seen as an arch-conservative US president, Ronald Reagan, who was willing to start working with the Soviets even before Mikhail Gorbachev started coming into power. And I think there are many reasons why Reagan did that. And the main reason, at least to me, is his fear and horror at the prospect of nuclear war. Being, I think, an optimist by nature, someone who is dedicated in ideological terms to the furtherance of capitalism and the victory of markets globally, the idea that this natural, almost God-given development could be interrupted by nuclear war was something that Reagan, under all circumstances, wanted to move away from. And that wasn't a product of his working relationship with Gorbachev. I think it came even before that. So sometimes you have these kinds of surprises in history. Now, it wouldn't have happened, I think, without Gorbachev. But when Gorbachev then came into power, he had someone on the American side to actually work with, which would not necessarily have happened under all US presidents. I actually can hardly think of another Cold War US president who would have acted in the same way, collaborative way, as Reagan did during those years. So that's the leadership-driven part of it. But then there are also the economic changes that I talked about earlier on. And these play a very big role in my understanding of why the Cold War ended in the way it did in the 1980s. So the idea of what we today call globalization, meaning that markets and market-based forms of economic interaction spread on a global scale, was something that was very hard to foresee from the 1970s on. And it wouldn't have happened without this massive expansion of finance capital that took place as a result of much more unregulated markets during the 1970s. This gave enormous advantages for those countries, including the United States, who were willing to take advantage of this. Advantage of it in terms of spreading their economic interaction on a global scale, quite literally to buy into this new economy that was being created, and which spread incredibly quickly because of the combination that happened in the midst of this process between computing power on the one hand. I don't need to tell anyone in Seattle about this. So computing power on the one hand and communications on the other, which is a way of saying the internet, but the internet in its very early form, right? That all of a sudden you could get market information on a global scale that you could not have access to before. So a lot of people were able to buy into this new system, except in the Soviet Union and the countries associated with it, which deliberately did not want to be part of this spread of the market system. Right? China opted in a different direction, which was also a massive reason, I think, why the Cold War ended the way it did. China had always been, under Mao Zedong, always been criticizing the Soviets, saying, you know, the Soviets are too cozy with the Americans and they are experimenting with markets. This is terrible. Until China itself moved exactly in that direction, right? And started making use of these new changes that took place in the global economy. The Soviet wouldn't or couldn't. And that's also a very important reason why the Cold War ended the way it did. So what is it that remains with us then of the Cold War today? So I say in the book that as an international system, the Cold War came to an end with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that bipolarity obviously is no longer here. But on the US side, in my view, international affairs, international policies have changed much less. So much, at least up to now, of the US approach to the world didn't change all that much with the end of the Cold War. It was still about the expansion of markets, expansion of capitalism, the expansion of American concepts of liberal democracy. Very little of that changed when the Cold War came to an end. The American alliance systems didn't change very much at the end of the Cold War. NATO is still in existence and has spread towards the east. So not all that much changed on that side. Some of the most significant problems that are with us today, of course, come directly out of the Cold War. Think North Korea, for instance. Probably the most dangerous conflict that we have in the world at the moment, certainly in terms of its possible consequences, is a remnant of the Cold War system. So I think we need to think in very clear forms about the past and the present on this. It doesn't make sense to me to say that relations between the United States and Russia today is a kind of new Cold War. It isn't, because the ideological element, the conflict between socialism and capitalism that really constituted the clash, that has gone away. I mean, the Soviet Union is no longer here. Russia today is an irritant in international affairs. It does a lot to stick it to the United States and other powers for that matter, but it's not based on Russia being a global alternative to the United States. Russia is still in many ways a country in decline, at least in economic terms, and will continue to be so for a very long time. China, the most likely challenger to the United States, of course, reads the Cold War very much in its own way. But even though I think there will be significant conflict between the United States and China over the years to come, it's very hard to characterize that as a Cold War, because the content of the Cold War, the ideological divide, simply isn't there. If you go to China, I'm sure many of you have been to China, some of you are from China, you will see a society that operates at least as much according to capitalist values as what the United States does, if not more. I mean, for me as a rather old-fashioned European, coming to China and seeing this intense commitment to getting ahead through markets and through investment can sometimes be a little bit too much for me. And it certainly outdoes much of what we see in other countries. Let me talk finally about lessons. So people ask me, certainly where I am now, and I'm sure here at the Jackson School as well, constantly, so what can we learn from the past? And that's a good question, and it's an important question to ask. Now, I don't believe that there are single lessons from the past. So if you hear someone here at the Jackson School or elsewhere trying to tell you the Cold War means that we should do this and that and not the other, you should be skeptical, right? Because there are many lessons coming out of any historical period of the past. But there are some broad implications, at least to me, that are there in terms of how the Cold War ended, which should have more of an influence on our thinking today. So the first one is that this idea that the Cold War gave rise to, that only your own system can be good, and that on the other side is necessarily bad or threatening or confrontational, is not the best way of conducting international affairs. Right? You can be convinced that other people are wrong and that they are acting in ways that go against your own interests. That's fine. That's based on your reading of the situation. But this totality of it, I mean, this idea that the concentration on absolutes that the Cold War led to was something that was very dangerous and led to a world in which people were willing to take immeasurable risks with the survival of humankind, not least through the nuclear competition. That aspect is a warning, I think, to all of us in terms of how we think about ourselves today and about the future. And the second issue that comes to me comes from the way the Cold War ended. So a lot of people during that time thought that it was likely, however much they feared it, that the Cold War was going to end in cataclysmic war. Because most of these bipolar systems that we have looked at throughout history end that way. When you have two big powers that confront each other relentlessly, war is usually quite close at hand. Now, the reason why most of us are here tonight is because that didn't happen, right? There was no nuclear war at the end of the Cold War. What there was a series of negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union, but also involving a number of other countries, that led to multilateral solutions to some, not all, as I said, but some of the biggest conflicts and the biggest challenges that the world was facing during that particular era. So don't let anyone tell you that the end of the Cold War was all about US power and the ability to bring the Soviet Union through its knees through military expenditure and relentless pressure on a global scale. There was one part of the Cold War, but it was not how it ended. The Cold War did not end through pressure, it ended through negotiations. And that's the way most international conflicts end, right? Sooner or later. And let us hope that in most cases in the future, it will be sooner rather than later. That's, to me, one of the biggest lessons that come out of the Cold War. So I'll end on that. Looking forward to your questions. Really, really good to be here tonight. Thank you. And I think the idea is that people could line up behind the mics on either side here, and then we could take questions. Yes, sir, please.
Could you talk a little bit about Russia's history of being invaded and their fear of NATO expansion?
Mm-hmm. So I think the Russian experience during both World Wars, the First and the Second World War, played a very big role for the degree to which Soviet leaders, or for that matter Putin today, are able to mobilize support among Russians. I mean, this sense, which had been proven over and over again in Russian history, that there was a real threat from abroad, right? That's something that made it easier to get people probably to oppose, but not to confront too directly, an economic and political system that really didn't work very well, or a political system under Stalin that was incredibly brutal and led to a series of horrendous crimes against its own population. The reason why they were able to get away with this for a long time, or one reason, was this sense that there was a very strong external threat that had proven itself again and again. One of the reasons, again, why the Cold War could only end through negotiations, right? Because this pressure wouldn't have worked because of this experience. Now, for today, some people are saying the same thing. And I do think it is important, in order to understand Putin and how he and his leadership group is thinking, to think about Soviet-Russian history throughout the 20th century, and maybe particularly what happened just after the Cold War ended, right? And I think this is something well worth thinking about. We could discuss it further tonight. In terms of the end point to the Cold War for the Soviet and then Russian state, was not something that many Russians saw as benefiting them directly. Right? The 1990s, just after the Cold War ended, is seen as a lost decade in Russia of chaos and confusion, of introduction of a capitalist system that most people didn't seem to benefit from. Some people got incredibly rich through it, right? Those who were able to take control of resources and present them as their own private property in a country that had no private property from earlier on. But those tended to be the well-educated, influential, powerful people. But for most people, this just did not end very well. That sense of being pushed aside, of being déclassé, of not having had any benefit from having ended the Cold War, I think is a major reason why Putin came to power in Russia to begin with, and why he is able to lie to his people the way he is today about what Russia's real interests are with regard to its neighbors and with regard to the international society. So one has to think, as I said in the talk, how people learn, how people draw their own conclusions from their own private experience, personal, in terms of family, in terms of what's most important to them. And Russia's encounter with capitalism and democracy in the 1990s was not a happy one, right? And that's part of the reason why we ended up where we are today. I'm not saying this is an attempt at excusing Putin's chauvinist and expansionist policies, but the reason why so many Russians, against better knowledge, are willing to go along with this. Yeah, please.
What are your thoughts on, in some recent polling, all right, 30% of millennials responding as having a favorable view of Joseph Stalin?
Yeah.
I mean, what is the rational response to
In
that?
Russia, you mean? Or globally?
I think it's globally, actually.
Goodness. Even worse than what I thought. Now, I must start by saying that I find it very difficult for anyone who studied the history of the Cold War, the history of the Soviet Union, to have much of a favorable view of Joseph Stalin. Not just because he was immensely brutal and committed a whole series of crimes against his own population. That's one thing. But also, in many ways, because much of what he tried to do failed, right? I mean, of course, ultimately the Soviet state itself failed. It's hard to put that directly at Stalin's door. I think in a structural sense you can probably do so. But most importantly, he failed because he was a significant part, his own thinking, was a significant part of bringing on the kind of militarized Cold War confrontation that the Soviet Union was not able to benefit from. That in many ways he played into the hands of what was by far the stronger superpower, the United States. Now, when I try to sell this argument in Russia, I don't get very far with it, right? Because what they see in Stalin, some Russians see in Stalin, even more Russians see in later Soviet leaders, such as Leonid Brezhnev, was exactly what they haven't had since. Stability, predictability, gradual progress. You might not be rich, but if you worked hard and if you saved, you have a decent living, right? While today is completely unpredictable. Now, what I worry about is that this attraction to dictators, past and present, is something that will play an even wider role in the world today, not just in Russia, where it happens for historical reasons that I think we can explain, but on a global scale overall. And that does worry me. Why does this happen? I have as little of an explanation as you do. I think one key reason is that the world has become much more complex, much more complicated, much more difficult to foresee in terms of what the future will bring. People on a global scale, as well as in Russia, want some degree of uncertainty and direction and things that they feel that they can stand for, not least in a national sense, right? I think that's coming back, but it's very often coming back in a form that makes one forget what kind of disasters that come out of some of these values through the 20th century. But maybe that's the point. You're mentioning millennials. So in terms of one's own historical experience that I've spoken so much about, maybe that's what's lacking in this particular historical experience for that generation. And that's the reason why people in the past who are seen as strong leaders are scoring so highly today, in spite of the other disasters that they led to. Yeah, please.
You mentioned that China is like integrated into the capitalist economy, and its intention is more like growing as a global power. But given its diametric views with regards to human rights and more values or ideologies that the Western world the Western world encourages, how much? So given these diametric views, how much are we underestimating China's intentions to be like Russia against the US?
But that's a really good question. So I mean, and this is something I've thought quite a bit about as well. So if we look a bit too much at the past, right, we sometimes reduce in terms of interpretation the kinds of things we are looking at a little bit too mechanically. So for instance, when I was saying that conflict between China and the United States most likely, but not the Cold War, is that a way for me to sort of reduce the Cold War just to be one set of conflicts? Now, I don't think I'm doing that, because I think it's important to be able to distinguish between different kinds of conflict, right? And I think that's exactly where we are with China today. I don't think it's very likely that the current leadership in China will try to roll back the markets, roll back capitalism in China, because I don't think they would be able to do it. I think the Chinese people today has benefited so much from that economic development that would be really difficult to do. Right? Even in a country that generally admires strong power, I think that would be difficult to do. But that's not the same thing as believing in different kinds of ways of organizing the state. And I think that is a significant difference between the United States and China. I don't think it is about national interest at all. I mean, at the moment in this country, we have a president who proudly says America first, which is very similar to what Xi Jinping would say about China. Right? He phrases it now in more multipolar, broader sense, but that's because it's in China's interest to do so. Right? So it's America in many ways that have changed more on this than what China has. I think China is, at the moment, under its current leadership, trying to become the center, the dominant power within its own region. I think gradually it will try to become predominant, probably further than that, outside of the Eastern Asian region, but that will take a great deal of time, mainly because of lacking capabilities still on the Chinese side for doing so. But I don't think, unless we in this country and in Western Europe and Japan or South Korea do something really stupid, I don't think that the idea of exporting the Chinese political model is something that is going to be at the center. Simply because, in spite of their immense pride in China's progress, I don't think there are all that many Chinese people today who in their heart of hearts believe that China has an overabundance of good governance, over other countries. There are significant problems with the Chinese one-party dictatorship that a lot of people in China are unhappy about. Now, if we really mess up on this side and give democracy an even worse name than what it has at present, it's possible that more people will say, well, dictatorship isn't that bad after all. But luckily, we're not quite there yet. Yeah.
One of the central claims you make in your last chapter, which is about the world the Cold War left behind, is that the US squandered its Cold War victory through post-Cold War triumphalism. In the spirit of also looking at the United States and international relations, could you a little bit elaborate on that?
So I think in the 1990s, there were enormous opportunities, first and foremost from the United States, but also by Europeans, to try to remake significant parts of the international system. So there would have been a strong willingness, I think, not only in Russia, but also to some extent in China, in taking the lead of the United States and Europe in trying to set up a more collaborative form of international security. And probably also to reform international organizations, the financial organizations, or even the UN itself, to become more representative and broader. And the United States and Western Europe did not use that opportunity. I think this happened for two reasons. I mean, one was the sense that the Cold War was over, the United States was dominant, and it could more or less do whatever it wanted to do. It didn't need to compromise with others. And this was as true, I think, for the Clinton era as it was for the George W. Bush era later on. It just had different form. For the Clinton administration, it was about the global victory of markets and integrative forms of capitalism. For the Bush administration, post 9/11, it was, for some understandable reasons, about what the United States could do unilaterally in the world to protect itself and to defeat its enemies. But both of those were lost opportunities, in my view, in terms of making a world that was not just based on American power and American influence, but much more broad-based in a collaborative form. Would that have worked? We don't know. We will never know. Was it worth the effort? Most definitely. And we didn't go far enough. And since I'm speaking here in a setting of a program looking at the United States in the world, let me stress that I blame Europeans as much as Americans for this. This is not just about the United States. It's also about Western Europe, Central Europe, deciding that Europe's border really ended where Russia begins, which I think is, in historical terms and cultural terms, nonsense. Right? So this idea that Russia would forever be outside any form of European integration, I think was, security-wise or economic, I think was a bad mistake. Russia couldn't have been integrated into NATO or into the European Union in the 1990s, but saying that it would never happen, is exactly the wrong signal to send to a people that felt that they had been hard on by, that they had been defeated in the Cold War. It should have been the opposite. Yeah.
How do you think the experiences and history of the global Cold War between the USSR and US informs the emerging Iranian-Saudi rivalry?
That's another good question. So I think, if you look at the Middle East as a whole, which has to be the starting point for understanding any the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the Cold War as a global system, in a way, froze conflicts in the Middle East, made it more difficult for them to end, but also made it more difficult for one side to have a victory against others. That's true even sort of up to and including the Iranian Revolution, the Shia Islamist revolution in Iran. Now, I think, for the Middle East, as in many other parts of the world, we are moving out of that shadow of the Cold War, and things have become much more fluid again. So it's been really interesting and quite shocking to look at how both Saudi Arabia and Iran have been wielding power within the region, particularly over the last couple of years, the conflict in Yemen, the conflict in Syria, the relationship that both of them, with very different markings, have to Israel. All of this has sort of come unstuck. And I'm really worried about what the future is going to bring for that region, without there being some sense of a more broad-based disciplining system that keeps the pieces in place. So notice what I'm saying here. This is not sort of Cold War nostalgia. On the contrary, it's a way of going back to the last question, saying, if we had used the opportunities that were there at the end of the Cold War, of integrating other countries into a more multipolar, multifaceted international security system, we probably couldn't have avoided rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are there for a whole host of reasons, but we would have been much better placed to contain it. Now there is no such containing mechanism that exists whatsoever. So I'm really fearful about what this will bring in the longer run. Few more questions. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Since you were raised in a Scandinavian socialism, or whatever we might call it here, it's always struck me that why hasn't it spread? I mean, we have a bunch of countries that are happy as lambs and clams. So that's part of it. And the other part is we are now digitizing the world, which seems to be a larger force than some things. How would you add those to the question?
Sure. Okay, so two-part question. Why, why hasn't Scandinavian social democracy spread to the rest of the world? Of course, all Scandinavians, particularly Norwegians, have been asking themselves that question over and over again. If everyone had just been like us. I think there are two reasons why it's unlikely to find a Scandinavian model that would be successful in its totality elsewhere. And the first one, of course, has to do with the economic basis. So, I mean, these are tiny countries with well-functioning economies which have developed state capacity in terms of dealing with issues such as poverty or the environment or social equality over a very long period of time. So they've been lucky that they've been able to do this. But that luck comes out of good economic fortune to start with, resource-wise in most cases, but also, of course, the relatively small population. Maybe the real answer, as many people in this state will see, is that they were able to export their population surplus to the United States and to Canada about 100 years ago, and thereby have a different kind of modernity for themselves. On digital issues, so this is something that a lot of people have started working on now with regard to the end of the Cold War, and I referred to some of this in my talk. But we haven't still quite figured it out. So if any of you want to write a good term paper or dissertation, on these issues, that's one that you could start looking at. What were the effects of the spread of new communication networks, let's put it that way in a broad sense, on the way the Cold War ended and the kind of world that we have today? What seems to me to be happening is that it's, like many technologies, it's pulling in two different directions at the same time. So it's moving in the direction of the world becoming scarier, I mean, in the sense that there is more surveillance, there is more state capacity to do things that you don't want to have done to you by the states. There is more capacity for different and new forms of warfare, what we often refer to as cyber warfare. There are all those aspects of changes in digital technologies and communications. But then on the other hand, there is this massive increase in a very democratic sense in terms of information. So some people would say, well, it isn't really democratic because it only affects the white middle-class world, or with some offshoots in Asia. I don't think that's true. So my daughter at the moment is working in a small village in western Uganda, very close to the Congolese border. And people in that area have access through the internet to information they couldn't have dreamt to have access to only a few years ago. Now, what they do with that information, of course, is entirely up to them, and they would take it in directions that we cannot foresee. But it opens up an ability to interact with the rest of the world that I would see, broadly speaking, as positive, right? To do things that they otherwise could not have done. So that's the other side to digital developments. We talk about digital divides, and I think that's very, very important, but there are also digital opportunities that one should try to make use of. And again, very much of that would not have happened, at least not in the way it's happened now, under Cold War circumstances. So that's one of the benefits, broadly speaking, of the end of the Cold War.
So these will be the final two questions.
Great, shoot.
I know you didn't speak much of it in your book, but in regards to Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union and the tensions that kind of build up to when they split apart, can you speak of kind of the threats that were kind of possible that could have gone wrong in the buildup of tension to Yugoslavia, to the Soviet Union, and to communism as a whole? And also...
Let's leave it at that for now.
Yeah.
I'll do Yugoslavia. So, okay. Now, Yugoslavia, I mean, the Balkans in general is one of the most interesting aspects of the Cold War, certainly in Europe, because you had dividing lines that didn't always follow what we traditionally think of as sort of socialist, capitalist, east-west kind of divide. So some of this happened by accident. I mean, Yugoslavia would have been a very different place during the Cold War if its leader, Tito, had not ended up in an acute conflict with the Soviets and with Stalin, right? which was as much caused by Stalin, by the way, as it was caused by Tito. The Yugoslavs didn't break away from the Soviet Union. They were thrown out. So that created a very different form of interactions with enormous consequences, in part because Yugoslavia was the only European country that oriented itself towards the global south, towards the third world, with very significant consequences. Again, an area that is completely understudied by people who look at this. Yugoslavia was the main supplier, the main weapons deliverer for many liberation movements in the third world that came to constitute states of great significance, well before the Soviet Union got involved. So some of that is actually really important. They were really important in setting up the non-aligned movement, which was founded in Belgrade in 1961, with a much wider reach than what you should expect a relatively small country to have. Now, the other side to that is, of course, the way the Cold War ended in Yugoslavia. So you could say, now I don't think this is all that difficult to understand. So pressure from the outside had kept Yugoslavia together. When that starts to wane, the constituent parts of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia were pulled in different directions. And again, I think there were enormous policy mistakes, not least on the side of Western Europe, that were made during those years. Now, I'm not blaming other Europeans for the civil wars in Yugoslavia. I mean, those came out of decisions, terrible decisions made in different countries, what is today different countries within Yugoslavia itself. But I do blame Western Europe for not having enough attention being paid to that region in order to try to prevent some of the worst excesses in the early phase of the breakup of Yugoslavia. Western Europe was far too centered on its own problems and its own issues in terms of the development towards the East, EU expansion into Eastern Europe, and security problems that had to do with the end of communism there. So there's blame in both directions. Final one, yes. Hello, good to see you again.
Hi. So my question is, how are the ideology conflicts today in terms of like how severe they are, what are the forms they take on, how people are dealing with different ideologies, and why is that?
That's a nice, brief, straightforward question at the end. No, but it is a good question because it's what I'm really saying, and you picked up on that ideology as an element in international affairs is gone, that it's no longer there. And there are people who are working on international relations, particularly political scientists, who are saying that. So that what we are looking at today is entirely different in its constitution, in its build-up, from what was the case during the Cold War. That now it's all about interest, national interest or collective interest. It's about culture, identification. It's about religion. Think the Saudi-Iranian conflicts, right? It's about a new form of identitarianism, that who you are in terms of your background is more important than the broader forms of thinking about how society should be organized. And you see some elements of that. You see significant elements of that in this country as well, as I think everyone will be aware. But I think one has to be careful with saying that that's the same thing as believing that people's ideas, concepts about better ways of organizing human society have entirely gone away. I have this sense, and this goes back to the point about millennials, that unless there is a dramatic change in terms of the more international, global ways in which the world is run at present, a strong suspicion that among many millennials, some of this belief in better ways of organizing society in a political ideological form may actually come back. They won't come back exactly in the same way as they have in the past. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, this idea of an absolute capitalism or absolute socialism, that I think is gone, right? But I do think that some of the elements that battle was about are very likely to reappear, but in slightly different forms. I mean, just think about the challenges that we are facing, whatever your political point of view is, with regard to social inequality. So I mean, to me, it's quite clear that that's a problem that was also here during the Cold War that has not gone away. In many ways, as the world has expanded, information has expanded, it's become easier to see and therefore more significant in terms of how people see it as a political problem. And it's very hard to find solutions to those kinds of issues by simply stressing state interest in a sort of broad sense. I mean, think about China in this context. So, you know, the Xi Jinping's point about China has risen. China has now become a powerful and respected country in the world. And that would be well and good, I think, for most Chinese, but it doesn't help poor people, for instance, in Western China, you know, who feel that they haven't really benefited very much from this, and they would be right in saying so, right? So these kinds of issues, I think, will come back in different forms in the future. Probably that is a good thing. That's something that, you know, we both have to learn to live with, but could also come up with some real solutions to some of the issues that we are facing at the moment. So on that optimistic note, again, thank you very much.